can have this evening. There is I guess the final of these Voices of Reconciliation will be May 28th, when our own LGBTQ folk will have a panel discussion. So please ask you to put that on your calendar. All the work ought to be, well, I don't know, the work's always being done in the cathedral, but some of the big work should be done, so we shouldn't have to worry about scaffolding and all that kind of thing as we go forward. Let's begin our time with prayer. It is a challenge, O God, to look at the past and realize how we were failed and how we've continued to fail in our stewardship of land and people and our gifts. We're thankful this evening that we can discuss a way of looking at the world, a context that afflicts us to this day, even if we're not aware of it. Thank you for Doe and what they bring to this evening. May this be a time of learning and joy together through Christ our Lord. Amen. We'll leave some time at the end for you to ask questions, but if in the middle of this you want to stop us and ask a question, that's perfectly fine. Glad to do it. By the way, my name is Jay Phelan. I am priest here at the cathedral and also theologian in residence. I'd like to start out by what appears to me to be a fairly obvious question. What is the doctrine of discovery and how did it come about? How did we end up with this particular notion that, as I said, has troubled us to this very day?
Yeah, great question. So in the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, we talk about the Doctrine of Discovery as a legal paradigm, or another way to think of that is a whole body of laws and policies, many laws, right? That really continue to determine how the land is treated, and especially how Indigenous peoples are treated. So under this system, the U.S. government has, well, I'm speaking about our U.S. context, but the Doctrine of Discovery is actually the basis for international law. But in our U.S. context, this was actually adopted into our law, and that name, the Doctrine of Discovery, comes from our U.S. Supreme Court in 1823. So I would say that's some of the how we got there in terms of it being our legal paradigm. Of course, we know that the Doctrine of Discovery has roots in papal bulls from the 15th century, and what that effectively did is that the church gave moral authority for economic and political motivations, for resource extraction, for taking of lands that were not already claimed by the Christian monarchies, right? So that's some of the history, but I think it's really important to understand it as still shaping our lives today. It's our current legal paradigm. So we see this, I actually got into this work in part because of Line 3 resistance. So we saw that in our own state just 5 years ago, where this tar sands pipeline was really fast-tracked through, to be built through Indigenous lands, despite a very large resistance movement led by Anishinaabe women that was very spiritual in nature, really uplifting the truth that water is the basis for all life on this planet. We have to protect our water, but none of that was really heard by our government, and this pipeline was allowed to be built anyway. And so seeing that unfold is, for me, what really activated me around learning more about the Doctrine of Discovery and feeling called into the work of dismantling it, not just as a church doctrine or something in the church, but all of our legal paradigm shaping all of our lives. So that's one way to answer the question.
The It seems to me the doctrine of discovery is like we used to say when we were kids, finders, keepers. And although it's been said that you can't discover a land that's already inhabited, but we did that, and then we claimed it anyway. And you mentioned the church in there, and what role did the Catholic Church and then later on more Protestant communities have in fleshing out this idea of a discovery, discovering lands that are unknown to Europeans at least, and assuming that they can just take them? How did the church get involved in that?
Well, I think, one thing that comes up in response to your question is thinking about manifest destiny, which we're often more familiar with in the U.S. And in that, there's the story of being like divinely ordained to take the land, right? And that very much comes out of what was said in the papal bulls. So this racial hierarchy, which is really the root of what we call white supremacy today, put white Christian European men at the top of that hierarchy and kind of everyone else falling below it. And so, the church, with the power and influence that it had at the time, I think was very instrumental in, again, giving that kind of moral authorization or sanctifying these aims, which were really economic and political. They were after the land, they were after the resources, and I don't know that they could have done that they could have subjugated or killed people without that kind of authorization from the church at the time.
Yeah, a lot of it is about converting the heathen too.
Yeah, and so
the motivation of the Pope at least was that you have these untapped lands that you could send your missionary monks into, and people like Junipero Serra in the Southwest, and but even with the folks that came in the Mayflower, the Puritans, they also had this idea that we're going to convert the heathen, we're going to convert them and civilize them. So that idea of converting and civilizing had it starts off in the 15th century, and it has a long, long tail, if you will, all the way up to all the Indian schools of the 19th and into the 20th century.
Yeah, and so even there, the church played a role in shaping that government policy. I know the Episcopal Church, but not only the Episcopal Church, many denominations or leaders in the time were really bringing that to the U.S. government, bringing that policy of assimilation, and sort of allowing that boarding school era to unfold through their interventions. I think that's another really key example of how the church has played a role in living out this doctrine of discovery as well.
Yeah, that you converted these people, and then you cut their hair and put them in suits, so that they were appropriately westernized. The very infamous statement, you kill the Indian in order to save the man, which was one of the leaders of the school movement. It was one of the things that he said. How is this doctrine of discovery connected to the idea of empire? And because I think it is, but how are those two things linked?
Well, I think about what does empire look like today, and I think the global capitalist system that we have is sort of, the empire that we're under right now, and certainly, these laws and policies that we call the doctrine of discovery continue to enable that empire, right? So the rich are continuing to get richer because our laws and policies make it legal for them to come onto indigenous lands and extract, whether it's oil and gas, or we're also seeing this with the green transition, a lot of those minerals needed for electric vehicles or for solar panels, things like lithium, copper, right, uranium. We're seeing like all these increases in mining on indigenous lands. And so the doctrine of discovery is absolutely continuing to enable and really legitimize extractivism. And so I really see that as like our modern day empire, and just like how
empires have to expand or die. Mm-hmm. You just kind of keep taking in more resources, and that philosophy, expanding or dying, I think, started with these European empires that were enabled by the doctrine of discovery. Mm-hmm. Some years ago, I read a book called King Leopold's Ghost, about King Leopold of the Belgians, and I recommend it to you, but it'll keep you up at night. And one of the things that the book said, Adam Hirschfeld is a writer, was that, late 19th century, all these European states are wanting colonies, The British have them, the French have them, and King Leopold wanted one too. It was like everybody had to have their own little empire, and in his case, it was what came to be known as the Belgian Congo, Zaire, and then Congo again. It's just a terrible story of misunderstanding and violence and exploitation. Empire's got an empire, they got to keep growing. Mm-hmm. Today is Earth Day, and you mentioned this earlier. What does the doctrine of discovery have to do with the land and the earth? Mm-hmm. It may seem that those two things are disconnected. One's a political statement about how you organize lands and people and who gets to decide, but I think there's a very direct implication between the doctrine of discovery and the way the earth is treated.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a good question, so I'm just going to sit with it for a moment. Think a lot about how the way I really came into this work was out of like a love of earth, a love of the water, and some of these movements to protect land and water. And so, when you come into those movements with a lot of earnestness and naivete, I think it can be really shocking to see that more often than not, these destructive projects go through. So again, with my line 3 example, that was really, for me, the activation point around the doctrine of discovery, because I had been doing a lot around public education, working with MN 350 and Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, their pipeline resistance teams. And I don't know, I was like, maybe if we have enough people power, maybe if these politicians can just like hear this message more deeply, right? And just recognizing that all of this is legal ultimately, that corporations can do this kind of building, that the government will side with them over impacted communities. There's no real recourse for those communities under a system like this. And then so often these communities are also, on the front lines of the discourse and the actual activism to protect land and water. So there's lots of, for me, overlap between like how do we, if we love the earth, if we want to be addressing climate crisis, can we see that this system, rather than buy into some of these green technology solutions, can we see that actually our entire paradigm needs to really shift? And we can no longer just senselessly extract from the earth. We actually have to do some of the spiritual work to reclaim, our own understanding of the earth as sacred, to really understand, find our unifying kind of purpose or charge alongside Indigenous communities. And so I see all of this work as really connected to like a desire to protect land and water, and really seeing how these legal systems make that almost impossible. And so they have to be transformed. And I will say I was also really drawn to the coalition because our co-founder, executive director, Sarah Augustine, she's a Mennonite and a Tewa Pueblo descendant, so an Indigenous woman. She's really calling Christians into this work, to come alongside Indigenous peoples in their movements for self-determination or for justice, for water and land protection, understanding ourselves as intertwined in resisting this system, right? To see our struggles as aligned, and that we as Christians are the intended beneficiaries of these systems, right? So, because they come out of the church, because at the top of the hierarchy is, white Christian men and white Christians, like we can all feel some responsibility to actually be a part of transforming these systems. And that was always really compelling to me because no one had ever issued that kind of a call to me before.
It's almost like the Doctrine of Discovery was permission to exploit.
Yeah.
Whether it was people or land or, Columbus writes back to his sponsors and says, these people will make good converts and great slaves. So it was a permission to exploit people and land and creation itself. You and I talked about Wendell Berry as one of my intellectual mentors, and he has a story called, in a book, an essay called A Native Hill, and he talks about this story of it came down from a Methodist pastor who went out with a group of men who were building a road in Kentucky, and this is in the 18th century, and it was a cold night, and the captain of the group said they should cut down some trees and build a fire. So they just cut down a great number of hickory trees and put them in a big pile and burned up all of them. And Barry makes this comment. On such a night as Reverend Young describes, an Indian would have made do with a small shelter and a small fire. But these road builders, veterans of the Indian War, felled the hickory trees in great abundance, made great log heaps, and caused them to burn rapidly. Far from making a small shelter that could be adequately heated by a small fire, their way was to build no shelter at all and heat instead a sizable area of the landscape. The idea that was when faced with abundance, one should consume abundantly, an idea that has survived to become the basis of our present economy. It is neither natural nor civilized, nor even from a practical point of view. It is to the last degree brutalizing and stupid. So these are colonizers, if you will, who came in and said, if you got a lot to consume, well, go ahead and consume it. And I think that's another part of that we're saddled with after all this time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, book recommendation, anything by Wendell Berry. So, you've mentioned this as well, but how is the Doctrine of Discovery connected with white supremacy? How are those two things put together?
There's a really good book that really talks about this called The Hidden Root of White Supremacy, which is all about the Doctrine of Discovery. Robert P. Jones is the author. And he really, he lays out kind of all this, so the rituals that in this, quote, era of discovery when these European explorers first came to Turtle Island or these shores, that, there were priests that would come, and there was like specific, I forget what it's called, but there was a specific reading that they would do to sort of claim the land for their monarchy. And then the process, and he follows this in 3 different kind of locations and tells this full story where, so it starts with that, church kind of claiming, with their authority, claiming the land for a particular monarchy. And then you see this like removal of indigenous peoples. And I think also keeping in mind that out of this paradigm or some of these papal bulls, the transatlantic slave trade was also authorized morally, right, by the church. So then as indigenous peoples are cleared from the land, there's the bringing in of exploited African labor to actually like work the land into, plantations and farms and things. And so in each of these places, he keeps tracing this story to an instance of racial violence against black men. And including in Duluth, he talks about Minnesota actually, and the lynching that was in Duluth. And so he's kind of tracing this through line of how the doctrine of discovery kind of creates this, this racialized hierarchy, right, that then across all these different times kind of escalates into racial violence. And so that shorthand phrase of like the root of white supremacy is often how I think of the doctrine of discovery, because of the racial hierarchies that come out of the papal bulls, but then the way that over time these just get reproduced by the power systems up until today and ongoingly.
Yeah. It's an assumption of European superiority in a way.
Yeah.
That the European culture is superior and it needs to be spread everywhere. And even goes to the maps that we see that distort the size of nations and put Europe and the United States at the center, those kind of flat maps. I can't think of what those are called. There's a special name for it. One of you will probably, yeah. So, that the European, the white European becomes the measure against what everybody else ranks and measures themselves. And again, if you're considering yourself the superior culture that's bringing civilization, white bread and ice cream to the people who are benighted or something, then that's going to be pretty easily communicated to them in the process. And then if you assume your superiority, you're going to assume their inferiority, because so you have all of these things, tangled up together, and it's to so many people just not noticeable. Why do you think that is? Why can't people grasp this or see this?
I think it can feel really abstract until we locate it in our legal system. I was just thinking, one of the ways that I've been seeing this play out, I've been listening in or attending in person the hearings. There's various bills to protect wild rice. So there's one on boating restrictions, there's one on pesticide revisions, and there's also one to change the language around wild rice as our state grain to include like inherent rights language. So it's like affirming wild rice has a right to exist in this state, right? And in that hearing in particular, the pushback that like Senator Kunesh in particular has to endure, kind of where you have this very clear clash of worldviews. You have a lot of indigenous activists lifting up, from their culture, all these teachings about the sacredness of wild rice, like it is a keystone species, it filters the water, it feeds the animals, it feeds the people, right? Like, and how that, just can't fully be received by some of these And unfortunately, it is often white men and Republicans, but it's almost like the
Yeah, we're a mess.
animosity. Yeah, there's like some animosity that can come back, or it's like the worldview clashes are just so apparent, like following this bill. And I think that the behavior that I'm often seeing just feels like, oh, this is the Doctrine of Discovery, or this is like white supremacy coming out in this courtroom, right? Or these racialized superiority, like thinking that or like white dominant culture way is the superior way, and they're not even open to hearing this, I mean, profound cultural and spiritual wisdom that's being shared with them from another cultural perspective. And really what they're advocating for is good for all of us, right? Like wild rice is an amazing food if we were taking care of our wild rice, if we were committed to this as a food source, in our state, we could be working together. But instead you see this just like clash of worldviews and this like overt racism that is just hard to witness sometimes.
I think some of it too is that you're like fish that doesn't notice the water. Years ago, my previous denominational life, there was a big youth event, and this one particular year they were doing it on diversity, and they were taking, before the event, a lot of young people around to different communities in the U.S. and churches, and as part of that, they made this film where they were talking to Asian, African American, Hispanic young people about their communal experience, what they liked about their community and their culture, and so the Asian, the Hispanic, the African American, they were all able to say things that they appreciated about their culture, and they asked this typical 17-year-old suburban white girl what she appreciated about her culture, and she didn't know what to say. It never occurred to her she had a culture. Her culture was just what was, and it was not something to reflect on. It was just the thing that existed that she swam in and never thought of it over against anybody else's culture. So I think that's part of what white supremacy does. It makes you not have to think about stuff, not have to reckon with what it means to be in relationship with other people, because they're always reacting to you because you have the dominant view that you really don't need to think about.
Yeah, I think also there's like a trade-off that comes with assimilating into whiteness, where so many of the more ethnic white immigrants had to leave their cultural and ethnicity behind in order to sort of fit into this system of power. So that there wouldn't be language or like dance or songs that were passed down, because the trade-off is the economic sort of power that participating in whiteness kind of can afford.
Yeah, if you want to make it in a society to make certain assumptions about the way things are, you better make those assumptions too, which in the end ends up losing part of your critical identity.
Yeah, and it moves us from being human beings into being consumers, right? And so it's like, I think of that young woman, and it's probably like, the culture that she's gotten through maybe like consuming TV or through consuming social media, right? As opposed to a culture that really teaches you who you are as a human being in orientation to your ancestors, to your community, right? It's a real loss.
Well, and you think about television and that kind of consumer culture as formation. When we talk about spiritual formation, that's cultural formation. You find out cultural norms, who you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to act, what you're supposed to wear. And it's a very, very powerful medium that, in, purposely or inadvertently, and a little bit of both probably, misshapes people that are trying to fit in some way. Mm. What other ways in your work do you see the impact of the doctrine of discovery, that things that may surprise us? We've talked about land, we've talked about culture, we've talked about people and white supremacy. Are there other things that when you got into it you thought, wow, I didn't imagine that it would touch this?
Yeah, more and more for me, I've been thinking about this work in the context of economic justice. So we have like an exercise that we lift up in our training that has people just identify things in your room or right around you. It could be your phone or your car keys or coffee or something, and actually look at what minerals are in this thing, or and where did those minerals come from? And what that does is it starts to dispel this myth that we're not in relationship with indigenous communities, because we're just by nature of being in this economic system, we're in these relationships of extraction, right? And the more I've really sat with that and thought about my embeddedness in these capitalist systems that harm indigenous communities all around the world, right? The more compelled I feel towards this work of reimagining our economic systems. And there's so many amazing organizations doing that. I mean, there's a lot of different models out there, probably too many to even name. There's Donut and well-being economics and many more that I'm forgetting in this moment. But they all basically are imagining a new economic system where instead of profit being the success of the system, it's community well-being. So well-being for people, well-being for planet, for our ecosystems. And that feels daunting and also exciting and hopeful work. And so I really think that there's so much to consider in that pivot towards economic justice. I see, repair as really relational, but there's also that component of, reparations and what opportunities do we have to actually return land or give towards land rematriation efforts, knowing that with a land base, indigenous communities can be recovering cultural traditions, can be recovering language. We're seeing that in Minnesota with Dakota relatives who are trying to have 10 interconnected Dakota eco-villages by the year 2050. This is the Makoce Ikikcupi project, which is Dakota for land recovery. So those opportunities to actually divest some of our wealth from the current economic system and think about how to invest that in the well-being of people and of planet feels like an exciting, I'm excited to continue in that vein. And that wasn't necessarily where I started. I started more with thinking about my role as a Christian descended person, or as someone who loves the water and had just been through this experience with Line 3 resistance. But that, continues, that economic justice path continues to be kind of where I see the work going.
Wendell Berry talks about along the same lines about the word commonwealth, that the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that the state's wealth is something that's held in common, not just possessed by a certain class of people, but it's there for the benefit of the entire community, not just a part of it. And I think he puts it a lot more eloquently than that, but I think it's a similar kind of thing that you're saying. You've started to talk about this a little bit, but as we draw toward the end here, it'd be wise for us to talk a little, before we turn it over for questions, about what are concrete steps that we can begin to take to address the implications of the doctrine of discovery. You've talked about some of those, but what are some of the things you're talking about in your organization and your work that can be done to begin to address this?
Yeah, well, we actually have an Episcopal Indigenous Justice Roundtable in our coalition. Clara attends sometimes, and you all would be invited, welcome to attend. So that is Episcopalians, lay leaders, priests, some bishops who convene monthly and, are starting to coordinate efforts across the church towards like kind of grassroots organizing. There's been a strong emphasis on the boarding school legislation that's been introduced by the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, as well as boarding school truth and healing efforts within the Episcopal Church. But we're also, kind of broadening some of our scope to also include some organizing within the various dioceses where we have organizers. So I know this year we're seeing if we can get more diocesan resolutions passed, actually kind of repudiating the doctrine of discovery. Not as an end in and of itself, but hopefully as a way to lead towards more organizing. So like in the Wyoming diocese, for example, they passed repudiation, ended up actually repatriating some ceremonial items back to a local indigenous group, and are now seeking a broader kind of organizing strategy towards supporting a buffalo land initiative project. So we've seen examples where at the diocesan level, these kinds of statements can actually further or deepen the commitment towards organizing alongside indigenous communities. So there's that Episcopal network. There's also, in Minnesota, we have Minnesota repair communities who are also connected to the coalition and are in close relationship with the leadership at Makoce Ikikcupi. And so that group convenes, we have a Minnesota-wide group with various repair communities that convenes one of the months, and then the other months, like Rochester repair communities or Twin City repair communities meet separately, and here too the idea is to get coordinated across the state on legislative action. So we've been working on advocating for the wild rice bills, and anytime there's like land return legislation that comes up at the state level, trying to advocate for that as well. So these are just some of the ways to get involved with kind of local efforts. And then as a congregation, you also might consider joining the repair network or joining the coalition and continuing to deepen in relationship with us and as a congregation seeking repair around the doctrine of discovery.
So what I've quoted Barry a number of times. He said he would always get questions from city people, what can we do to make sure that the land is being treated well in agricultural settings? And he said, eat intelligently, buy food that is healthy and good and from people who are not exploiting the land. And it can all seem so overwhelming and so impossible when the powers are so great that we can lose the vision of the little things that we can do, and that may not seem to be very much, but in the end have a significant. It could have a significant impact upon the future as well.
Yeah, and one thing that's felt meaningful for me to be a part of the coalition is that there is a much longer, we talk about having a 100-year vision. So sometimes we, want to ask, well, if not the Doctrine of Discovery, what is the legal paradigm that would replace it? And there is a document called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this was, I think, released in 2010 or somewhere around there. A lot of collaboration from indigenous communities around the world. And what we put out there as a possibility, who knows if this will be what the future ones will do, but what if that document, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, were adopted as a constitutional amendment, right? So if that's possible, maybe 100 years from now, what work can we be doing right now so that we're really just preparing the soil for the ones who are going to come after us, so that that might be possible in their time, right? And so it is far off, and sometimes that can be like a deeper breath, right? To know, oh, okay, I can be working at something for the rest of my life, instead of sometimes these timelines of specific campaigns. They can feel very fast and urgent, and then they're over quickly, and where do you put your energy now? And so this much longer vision, this understanding that it's going to take us many decades to actually undo these systems, for me, it invites a deeper breath. So I hope that might also be the case for you all too. There is much work to be done, but we're not doing it alone, and we must do it together. So.
And at this point, guilt is useless. Feeling bad about something in the past, what do we do going forward? How do we make a difference in the future rather than mea culpa and beating your chest? That can just simply end up as being self-indulgent. You're feeling a little bit better because you feel bad. And that really, in the long run, doesn't help anyone. And the actions that we take toward health and away from that which is destructive makes a lot more difference. You and I were talking too. Right now, we have been presented with another dangerous extractive thing, and that's what's happening in the boundary waters. And it was just recently the mining that it's going to be permitted up there. Have you had conversations about that in your organization? Or I know that also has implications for native lands and for indigenous lands and so forth.
Yeah, there was just a rally at the Capitol this morning. Friends of the Boundary Waters put that on. But yeah, I mean, yet again, it's the same thing, right? It's this this paradigm of, oh yeah, we don't need to preserve, or care about this beautiful wilderness place, right? Because there's a possibility to make money off of the minerals here, and that's the priority over, protecting this beautiful place, this legacy type place for the future generations. It's so short-sighted, and I think in this moment, think of how many people in Minnesota have deep personal connection to the Boundary Waters. I think sometimes love, love for that place, love for the earth, is the thing that is just gonna sustain us for the long term. So guilt, shame can certainly be a motivator in this work, but I find that reframes towards, what do I love? What am I really trying to protect in this work? Is really kind of getting to the heart of where we can really work together with indigenous communities. Because, sometimes that posture of feeling really guilty or ashamed, it impacts the relationship, right?
Yeah.
It actually demands something of our indigenous relatives, as opposed to showing up rooted in our love. It just kind of creates this posture of collaboration and shared endeavor. So yeah, I would just encourage folks to really feel the love for the Boundary Waters and that place, and invite those conversations, because that can be such a powerful place to organize from.
Yeah, Paul didn't say it's faith, hope, and shame. The greatest of these is shame. That was not. That's not there in 1 Corinthians 13. Well, we got about 10 minutes before we should do our, and I see David has a hand up already. Is there a mic? I think.
Doe, your presentation has inspired a lot of thoughts. I think one of the most obvious things we're not seeing, maybe not talking about right now, is the powerful unspoken assumptions of the doctrine of discovery are playing out in our world right now. Mm-hmm. We have a president who is a deity to many people. Yeah. And he and the evangelical right Christian has really been brought into this world in seeing that what he has, which I think is also his design to maintain the white male patriarchy. And they're scared shitless because the world is getting browner. And the reactive part of this is, you know, I see these assumptions coming up because they provide some sort of moral authority to what is going on. It's exploitative, it's dangerous. They have demonized people. If you're an immigrant, you know, so this whole thing that you're talking about is playing out in real time in a big way. So the recognition of this for me is a sensibility of, okay, there's some foundational beliefs that inform this and empower it. Because you get moral authority, you can do a lot, right? So the Pope says it's fine. Trump says we want Greenland. Manifest destiny, you know? And this, so I just want to make this point. Maybe it's more obvious to others, but it is playing out clearly in our world right now. So I'll stop at that.
Freedom for whom is the question.
Well, yeah, and that the maintenance of a system which very clearly is exploitative. And it defines the relationship between people and land and people, because there's a hierarchy, which is sometimes not even seen, but it's there. Okay, I'll pass it on.
Do you have a comment on that? Or?
Oh, I so appreciate your analysis and like the ways that you pointed out. It is playing out right now in all these different ways. I feel like we saw that with the ICE occupation here too, right? And like, so yeah, there's like philosophical as well as legal kind of things where we can see it really everywhere. I think it actually could be connected, you know, whatever your social justice issue is, you can probably connect it to the doctrine of discovery because it's that kind of deeply rooted to all of the ills of our time. So yeah, thank you.
Is there another? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doe. I am wondering, kind of in the context of this broad, not just in the present, but past and future lens, as well as reacting a little bit to what you talked about, Jay, with guilt. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role of repentance and the importance of repair to having some of these really deep relationships. Part of white supremacy is wanting to kind of gloss over what maybe we did, or to not acknowledge how that continues to play out in our current lives, and just fix it. Without going through even some of the rituals of repentance, and realizing that this is not just a let's throw money at it, although that's very important, that we need to talk about more, but it's not just sort of a fixing, but it's also a spiritual thing, like actually dividing the spiritual from it is part of that white supremacy. So I'm wondering if you can talk some, especially from the song leader role too, as to what role repentance and the ritual of that plays in repair, particularly in the church context.
Yeah, thank you. Such a good question. I think there is ongoing repentance work because ultimately what we're being called to is paradigm change, right? We're being called to transform our culture, transform aspects of our practice potentially as Christians, and recognize the ways that, as we see, it's everywhere. We've been encultured into this kind of a paradigm. And so, repair is really a relational process. The process of repair that we talk about in the coalition, has to start with truth-telling, and actually, listening to the injured party, which, in our work, we are considering Indigenous peoples, right? We actually have to listen well to even know what repair can look like in that context, right? So it's inherently more relational than just like a transactional kind of, writing a check. And so, I'm curious about to hear more about kind of repentance work that is happening in the church. Certainly there are rituals of lament that I think can really allow us to feel the grief of this history. But I'm interested in just thinking about how repentance is really connected to this kind of worldview transformation that we're really called to in this work. Did I address everything in your question? Or you said something about songs too.
Oh yeah, I think maybe you can talk to them about the way that songs show up as a way to metabolize some of that truth in our bodies.
Yeah, we created a playlist in the coalition called the Songs for Sacred Lands. So these are that kind of community singing, shorter style songs that can be taught by ear or call and echo. And, some of the songs in that collection really are about, there's one where the words are like, return what was stolen, return what we can, return to the sacred, return to the land. So just imagine singing that in worship. I know stories of that song in particular where it's it was shared at a conference, and the bishop sang it to close, at an ELCA in Canada, right? And then it traveled to another congregation where they were using it as a land acknowledgement in the month of honoring Indigenous peoples in Canada. So, these songs can often be containers for this work, or like you were saying, help us actually metabolize some of this work. So if that is a curiosity, just that there are some of these songs out there, that's just a freely available resource on the Coalition's website. And as I'm thinking about that collection, there's another one on there about just unlearning. It just talks about all the unlearning we have to do, and how we're recommitting towards learning towards what's true, right? So, yeah, just different ways that song can support us as we're actually emotionally processing the things that come up as we do this work.
Yeah, I was thinking as you're speaking of song, of how important song was in the whole resistance to ICE, and the clips of people singing together. Yeah. And of course that goes all the way back to the civil rights movement, and the power of song to bind the people together, and to sometimes the repetitiveness of it to ingrain the message in a profound way. And as you say, a lot of these songs can be learned quite easily by ear, and one does not necessarily know how to sing, but just make a joyful noise, and you can contribute to what's going on. We probably have time for one more question. If somebody has another question they want to ask or a comment they want to make.
So as I look around here, most of us are baby boomers, and this is something that we did not grow up thinking about, learning about. It wasn't in our schools, I don't think. So I'm wondering if you find that it's hopeful that we're starting the conversation now, and generations behind us will start to be more conscious of this kind of teaching, not in this administration, but hopefully administrations to come will allow this kind of thing to be taught at schools. But do you see that as you look around at the people who are working with you?
Yeah, I think, well, a lot of our strategies in the coalition is to really call the church in. So of course that's going to typically be some of the older generations. And that being said, I think there is some of this kind of awareness of colonization in some of the younger generations, or there's like a position that's already kind of a little bit in alignment with recognizing that these systems are failing and we need other systems. So I think I think the alignment is there politically. I think, you know, we're in discernment about, well, how do we actually organize younger folks who aren't in church? But this is really, there's spiritual aspects to this organizing, like to some of the transformation that we were just talking about. So I think I have a curiosity about what that can look like with younger generations. And we're starting to see, you know, there are students or, you know, college-age students that are finding us, or, you know, like, it's always interesting how people will sometimes find, you're not trying, but they come find you. So all to say, I think it's a great question and a good noticing, and we'll see, I suppose, yeah.
Like you said, it's a long haul thing.
Right.
But if we can teach our grandchildren, or, you know, we can start passing these messages on,
Yeah.
maybe there's hope.
Yeah, yeah.
Before we go, was there another question?
One more, yeah.
Okay, go ahead, please.
You mentioned the wild rice work that you're doing, and with the legislature soon coming to an end, do you see any of these bills getting through, and are there some that we should be advocating for, or is this more of a long-term?
I think most of
goal?
them have been rolled over for inclusion in the omnibus bills, so I would maybe take a close look. If you don't see any of these wild rice bills in that omnibus bill, we'll probably hear some calls to action from the Rise and Repair Alliance. But I think that happened last year, where it was rolled over for inclusion and then behind closed doors was like not included. So it does seem like sometimes you need multiple legislative sessions and building pressure over time to really make something pass. So I think it's a good question, and definitely please pay attention. And riseandrepair.org, I think, is the website. They have really great like weekly e-blasts where they summarize, and they're tracking, you know, some of the data center bills and all kinds of, their whole platform is Indigenous rights and climate action. So would just really encourage connecting with their communications, because they're so helpful.
Will you be able to just compile the list of resources that you said you've been mentioning? Because I haven't always been able to hear what you've been saying, or, you know, like just that one you just, I didn't, you just said, oh, that's a really good one too. So, I mean, just give it to David or whatever as a way to follow up on what we've been hearing.
Yeah, so some of the books and coalition resources and local resources, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure you have some things on your website that could be seen, and that'd be good to. In fact, I was going to recommend a book that I've had for a while. You know how you have things on your shelf, and this was done 2019, and I've been reading it, about halfway through it, and it could have been written last week. It's called Unsettling Truth: The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery, by Mark Charles and Soon-Chan Rah. Mark Charles, I think many of you know as an indigenous leader who's well known for his work. Soon-Chan is a Korean American, and he's one of my colleagues at North Park, and this is done by University Press. and is actually quite good, so, and very readable, and makes a lot of the kind of connections that we're discussing tonight, and maybe the kind of thing you could use with some of your more conservative friends in this. But that's one I recommend, and as I said, there's a lot of crossover between the kind of work we're talking tonight and the kind of work that someone like Wendell Berry has been doing, and prominently and powerfully for so many years. I want to thank Doe for their presentation and being with us tonight. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Ron.
We have a reception out here, and so talk to Doe and ask her the hard questions that you couldn't ask her then, and ask them then, and we'll look to see you, all of you again, in 28th of May. So, thank you all.